Tales for Dark Nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications. The following program is a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com to learn more about this and our other weekly storytelling programs, and become a patron today to show your support and get instant access to our extensive archive of downloadable ad-free tales of terror. Thank you for listening, and enjoy the show.
Disclaimer: Horror Hill is a horror anthology podcast bringing you scary stories from all corners of the internet and beyond. As such, certain stories include content that some listeners might find offensive. Listener discretion is advised. Happy Halloween, friends, and welcome back to Horror Hill. I'm your host, Erik Peabody, and tonight we're finishing up our story from last week. The story is titled Ethan Hell by author Craig Groshek, and if you haven't heard the first half yet, I recommend giving it a listen before you jump into this episode. For those of you that have heard the previous entry, here's a quick recap. Ethan Hull is an ER nurse whose life has been growing increasingly difficult. His fiancée has a serious drinking problem, and the consistent nightmare of the emergency room has been wearing away at Ethan's mental faculties. After being stabbed by a patient, Ethan loses it entirely and strangles the man to death. Later, in a jail cell, Ethan is approached by Dr. Atticus Hargrove, a mysterious and malevolent figure in a plague doctor's mask. Hargrove offers Ethan a way to escape from his predicament, as long as he's willing to do the doctor's wishes. Ethan agrees, not knowing that Hargrove intends for him to collect the souls of the damned. We jump back in tonight after Ethan has started down this dark path, and it's anyone's guess where it leads. But before we get into the story, have you heard that we've published a collection of our own dark tales, including one written by yours truly? Head over to chillingbook.com, that's chillingbook.com, to take a look, and maybe just order a copy of your own. Go ahead. I dare you. You're listening to the standard edition of this program. If you'd like to help support Horror Hill and also remove these pesky ads, head to chillingtalesfordarknights.com and click Patrons in the upper menu to sign up today. You'll get instant access to hundreds of ad-free stories, and we can scale back some of our less savory means of generating money for the show. By the way, you wouldn't happen to still have all of your organs, would you? And now, from author Craig Groshek, I give you Ethan Hell, Part 2. Chapter 7. The passage of time had become meaningless to Ethan. Days bled into weeks and weeks into months as he carried out Dr. Hargrove's orders with increasing detachment. The once vibrant city of Minneapolis was now a blur of gray buildings and faceless crowds, its streets filled with people who moved like shadows, unaware of the darkness that lurked among them. Ethan had become efficient in his work. The first few souls he harvested had shaken him to his core, but as the tasks multiplied, as the souls piled up, the horror of it all began to dull. It was a necessary evil, or so he told himself. Even so, each time he delivered a soul to its damnation, he felt another piece of his own slip away, lost to the abyss that had become his life. He no longer questioned Hargrove's orders. The plague doctor's shadow loomed over him, an ever-present reminder of the pact that bound him. Ethan's body moved on autopilot now, his mind numb to the terror and pleading of those he was sent to collect. The faces of the damned blurred together, their voices indistinguishable in his memories. There was the businessman, a sharp-suited figure who had once commanded power and respect, now reduced to a trembling wreck as Ethan cornered him in his penthouse office. The man had offered bribes, promises of wealth and influence, but Ethan's hand had been steady, his resolve unshaken as he delivered yet another sinner to their final destination. Then there was the young woman, barely out of her teens, whose crimes were etched in her eyes, a shadow of guilt following her every step. She had wept, begged for forgiveness that Ethan could not provide, her cries echoing in the empty alley where he had found her. Ethan felt a pang in his once human heart as he extinguished her hope, but his hand had remained firm, compelled as he was to finish the job. And there was the old man, frail, sick, and bitter, whose time had long since passed. He acknowledged Ethan with a sarcastic smile, as if he knew the day would come. There had been no struggle, no pleas for mercy, only a stubborn insistence that he had been the victim throughout his life, that his sins were not his fault, and that he was the universe's whipping boy. Each soul was a reminder of what Ethan had become. The repetition had numbed him to a great degree, and yet guilt and revulsion remained, ever present, eroding what was left of his conscience. But its impact was akin to that of a distant echo, something he could push aside as he moved from one victim to the next. His thoughts often drifted back to Emily during these times of detachment. He remembered the warmth of her embrace, the way her eyes had sparkled when she laughed, the softness of her voice as she whispered his name. But those memories were fading as the distance between them grew, replaced by the brutal reality of the life he now led. He had no idea when he would see her or his beloved dog Sherman again, or if he ever would. All the while, Dr. Hargrove watched over him with an inscrutable, calculating gaze, guiding Ethan farther and farther from the empathy that had once defined him. His otherworldly benefactor never praised, never scolded. He simply observed, ensuring that Ethan remained on the course set before him. The few times Ethan had dared to question his orders, to ask why particular souls were marked, why they deserved damnation, Hargrove's response had been the same: indifference, a simple reminder of the pact they had made. "There is no need for you to understand, Mr. Hall," Hargrove had said. "Your obligation is to carry out my wishes, nothing more." And so, Ethan had complied. He swept through the city like a phantom, his presence unnoticed by those around him, his face blurred to anyone who might perceive him as a threat. But even as Ethan's mind faltered, a small part of him remained aware, a flicker of the man he had once been. It was this part of him that kept the memories of Emily alive, that refused to let go of the shame and heartbreak that had led him here. It was this part of him that began to resist, quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, but with growing fervor. Each time he harvested a soul, Ethan felt that defiance grow. It was a slow, painful process, like a wound that refused to heal, but it was there, persistent, a reminder that at one point he had been more than this, been a man with free will, autonomy, and a purpose in life aside from death and destruction. As time passed and the tasks continued, Ethan found himself at a crossroads. The toll of repetition had hardened him, dulled the edges of his humanity, but it had also awakened something within him, a desire for redemption, for an end to his insidious vocation. But that end seemed far off, a distant hope that Ethan couldn't quite grasp. For now, he was trapped, bound by the pact he had made, and the only way forward was to harvest the souls that Dr. Hargrove demanded. Yet deep inside, Ethan knew something had to change. The man he had been, the man he still was beneath the surface, wouldn't allow him to continue along this path forever. He was headed toward a breaking point. It was only a matter of time. Chapter 8. Ethan moved through the city, completing his assignments with increasingly mechanical precision, but something had changed. He could feel it just beneath the surface. The detachment that had initially shielded him from the horror of his actions was beginning to crumble. And at times, he wondered if Dr. Hargrove, too, could detect the hints of his burgeoning insolence. It began with a man who met Ethan's cold gaze with tears of regret, not fear. The man, grizzled and worn from a life of sin, didn't run or beg for his life. Instead, he fell to his knees and clasped his hands together, whispering a prayer. "I know what I've done," the man said, his voice thick with remorse. "I've hurt people, ruined lives, but I'm sorry, truly. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to say it. I'm sorry." Ethan stood over him, the power within him pulsing, urging him to complete the task. But something inside Ethan hesitated. He had seen fear, anger, and denial in the faces of those he'd harvested, but this was different. This was true repentance, and it stirred something deep within him, a memory, perhaps, of what it meant to be human. You think that matters?" Ethan found himself saying, his voice wavering. It was the first time he had spoken to one of his targets with anything other than indifference. The man looked up at him, eyes filled with tears. "Maybe not to you, or to anyone else, but it matters to me. If there's any chance, any at all, that I could be forgiven, I need to try." Forgiveness. The word echoed in Ethan's mind, foreign and yet familiar. He had never been a man of faith, never one to seek redemption or believe in second chances, but something in the man's plea resonated with him, and for a moment, Ethan wondered if it was possible. Could this man, could he, find forgiveness for the things they had done? But as quickly as the thought entered his mind, Dr. Hargrove's voice cut through it, as if summoned by the very act of questioning his lot in life. "Do not be swayed by the weakness of humanity, Mr. Hall." Dr. Hargrove's voice reverberated in Ethan's mind. "Forgiveness is a myth, a fairy tale spun by those who cannot face the consequences of their actions. There is no redemption, no salvation, only the path you have chosen and the duty you must fulfill." Ethan clenched his fists. The man before him continued to plead, but Ethan's heart hardened, the fleeting hope of forgiveness crushed by the weight of his pact. "You're wrong," Ethan whispered, though whether he was speaking to the man or to Hargrove, he wasn't sure. "You're wrong, and it's too late to change anything." The man's face crumpled as Ethan reached out, latching onto his soul and pulling it from his body. The light in the man's eyes flickered and faded, and his body slumped to the ground, lifeless. Ethan stood over him, feeling the familiar ache settle back into his bones. But the moment haunted him. Even as he carried out his next task, and the one after that, his latest victim's words lingered in his mind. He began to see it in the eyes of others, too. Remorse, repentance, a desperate plea for a chance at redemption. And each time, Ethan felt that same flicker, the same doubt. The woman who had spent years manipulating and hurting those around her had fallen to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she confessed her sins. "I know what I've done," she had sobbed, "and I wish I could take it all back. Please, give me a chance to make it right." The man who had spent his life chasing wealth at the expense of others had stood before Ethan with trembling hands, whispering, "I was wrong. I see that now. If there's any way to undo the damage I've caused, I'll do it. Just, please, don't let this be the end." Ethan felt his resolve weakening with each encounter. He began to question whether he truly had no choice, whether the agreement with Hargrove was as binding as he had been led to believe. Was forgiveness really make-believe? Or was there something more, something Hargrove didn't want him to see? Ethan began to suspect that Hargrove was lying to him, keeping him in the dark to maintain control. And yet, the more Ethan resisted, the stronger the doubt grew, the need to break free before the last vestiges of his humanity were smothered. Ethan knew he would need to be careful. Hargrove was always watching, always waiting for any sign of disobedience. But Ethan was growing tired of being a puppet, of carrying out a demonic agenda he didn't believe in, of damning souls he felt could be saved. As he walked through the streets of Minneapolis, the city alive with the lights and sounds of an oblivious populace, Ethan felt a strange sense of calm. He was still bound by his deal with Hargrove, still trapped in a life that wasn't his own, but now he had something he hadn't felt in a long time. A purpose. He didn't know what the future held, or if he would even survive. But he knew one thing. He wouldn't let Hargrove control him forever. And so, as the night stretched on and the city slept, Ethan schemed. He would find a way to break the pact. He would find a way to be forgiven, even if it killed him. Chapter 9. Ethan's footsteps echoed through the empty streets as he made his way back to the small, dilapidated apartment he now called home. His mind was a storm of thoughts and emotions, each more turbulent than the last. The encounters with the repentant souls had shaken him to his core. Their pleas for forgiveness, their desperate hope that redemption was possible, had stirred something within him that he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. But with that desire came fear. Dr. Hargrove had made it clear from the beginning that there was no escape, no way out of their agreement. Or so he claimed. Ethan suspected there was more to it, and that Hargrove wasn't telling him everything. As Ethan reached the apartment, he paused at the door, his hand hovering over the knob. An all too familiar dread settled over him, but this time it was laced with something else. Anger. Anger at Hargrove for the lies and manipulation, the cruelty that had twisted his life into something unrecognizable. And anger at himself for ever making the pact in the first place. Would it have really been so bad if he had simply taken responsibility for his actions, lawyered up, and served his time? Compared to his present circumstances, a lengthy, uneventful prison sentence seemed appealing. Ethan pushed open the door and stepped inside, the stale air instantly assaulting his senses. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the city lights filtering through the grimy windows. Ethan made his way to the small, worn-out couch and sank onto it, burying his face in his hands. He had to do something. He couldn't continue like this, couldn't keep damning souls that might have a chance at redemption. But what could he do? The power that bound him to Hargrove was strong, and the consequences of defiance were terrifying. Ethan knew that if he acted against Hargrove, the plague doctor would retaliate, and undoubtedly, those Ethan cared about most would be targeted. But the thought of spending an eternity at the mercy of such evil influences was unbearable. Ethan's mind raced, searching for a solution that didn't end in disaster. Each option seemed impossible, every plan doomed to failure. And then, in the midst of his despair, a thought occurred to him. A dangerous, desperate thought, but one that Ethan couldn't ignore. What if he simply confronted Hargrove? What if he insisted, demanded to know why he had been chosen and how he could end the pact? The idea was terrifying, but it was the only one that made sense. Ethan knew that Hargrove was hiding something, that the doctor wasn't telling him everything. And if Ethan could get the truth, maybe, just maybe, he could recover some semblance of his past life. He had to fight back, even if it meant risking everything. He wouldn't back down, no matter what the cost. But as he turned toward the door, preparing to leave the apartment and seek out his employer, a voice echoed in his mind, stopping him in his tracks. "Going somewhere, Mr. Hull?" Ethan froze, his blood turning to ice. The voice was unmistakable, Dr. Hargrove's, as emotionless as ever. Ethan slowly turned around, his eyes scanning the shadows of the room. And then, from the darkest corner of the apartment, Hargrove emerged. The doctor's form seemed to materialize from the shadows themselves, his tall, imposing figure dominating the small room. His mask glinted in the faint light, the empty eyes staring directly at Ethan. Ethan held his tongue. Hargrove had known. Of course he had. The plague doctor always knew. But Ethan wasn't going to let that stop him. Not now. "I want answers, Hargrove," Ethan said, his voice steady despite his worry. "I want to know why you chose me and how I can end this." Hargrove tilted his head slightly, as if considering Ethan's words. "End this? Mr. Hull, you cannot end what has already been set in motion. You are bound to me, to the pact we made, and there is no running from that." Ethan took a step forward, his anger flaring. "That's a lie, and you know it. You've been hiding things from me, keeping me in the dark. I deserve to know the truth." Hargrove was silent for a long moment, the tension in the room thickening with each passing second. Finally, he spoke, his voice colder than ever. "Very well, Mr. Hull. You want the truth. Then I will give it to you." Hargrove stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, the temperature dropping several degrees with each step he took. "You were selected because your fate was sealed long before you and I met. You were always destined to serve as the harbinger of hell, the one who would bring damnation to those who deserve it. Our agreement was merely a formality, a means to an end." Ethan reeled at his words. Harbinger. A formality. Destined. Had his involvement in this infernal plan really been inevitable? The suggestion that he had no choice in the matter, no free will, was as demoralizing as it was surprising. Surely he wasn't perfect, but his years dedicated to serving others had to count for something, right? He was no angel, but no, he thought. This can't be how things work. Before he could mount an argument, Hargrove continued. "There is no escape from this, Mr. Hull," his voice low and menacing. "You can resist all you like, but in the end, you will fulfill your promise. You will harvest the souls I instruct you to, and you will bring about the vision that has been foretold." Ethan's heart threatened to give out, but even as despair threatened to consume him, something inside him pushed back. A spark of defiance, a refusal to accept the fate that Hargrove had laid out for him. "No," Ethan said, his voice trembling but resolute. "I don't believe you. There has to be a way out, a way to break free from you." Hargrove's mask glinted in the dim light, his silence heavy with unspoken threats. "You are mistaken, Mr. Hull. There will be no absconding. There is but one path, and you are on it, up to and until the bitter end. Ethan shook his head. I didn't choose this. You forced me into it, but I'm not going to let you control me anymore. Hargrove's voice dropped to a whisper. Be careful, Mr. Hull. Non-compliance has its consequences. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine, but he didn't back down. I don't care about your threats. I want out of this pact, and I'm going to find a way to break it, whether you like it or not. The room became unnervingly quiet, the tension so dense it seemed to hang in the air. Ethan braced himself, expecting Hargrove to lash out, to punish him for his defiance. But instead, Hargrove simply stepped back into the shadows, his form disappearing into the darkness. You may try, Mr. Hull. His disembodied voice filled the air. But you will find that breaking the pact is far more difficult and costly than you can imagine. And with that, Hargrove was gone, leaving Ethan alone. Ethan stood, paralyzed, for what seemed like an eternity, his mind aflame with a barrage of conflicting thoughts. Hargrove's words echoed in his mind, but Ethan refused to let them take root. He couldn't give in to the despair, the hopelessness that the plague doctor had tried to instill in him. There had to be a way out. He didn't know what it was or how he would find it, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let Hargrove win. Ethan took a deep breath. He would find a way to break the pact. He would reclaim his humanity, and he would bring down Dr. Hargrove, no matter what the cost. But as Ethan sat back down on the couch, his mind still reeling from the confrontation, he couldn't shake the feeling that Hargrove's parting words were more than just a threat. Breaking the pact would be difficult and costly. Ethan knew that whatever price he would have to pay, it would be steep. But it didn't matter, not anymore. The breaking point had come. Chapter 10. Ethan had crossed a line, and there was no going back. However, he still felt the compulsion to complete his tasks, and for the time being had no choice but to acquiesce to the doctor's will. He had made up his mind, but the timing wasn't right. Not yet. The confrontation with Dr. Hargrove had solidified his resolve, but with it came a terrifying transformation, as if he had been endowed with a parting gift from his ghastly benefactor, tempting him with the promise of more, so much more. Ethan's powers, once subtle and subdued, were now growing at an alarming rate, and Ethan wasn't the only one that realized it. The world around him had started to take notice. The news channels were abuzz with reports of a mysterious figure, an enigma who appeared in the darkest corners of the city, evading capture with a skill that bordered on the supernatural. Witnesses described a man with a blurred face, his features impossible to discern. He was untouchable, an omnipresent ghost who could not be caught on film. It wasn't long before Ethan began to exploit this growing notoriety. He had become something more than just a man. He was now a symbol, bending the will of those around him, spoken of in hushed tones in households across Minneapolis. With each soul he harvested, his reputation grew, and with it, the fear that gripped the city. As if on schedule, Ethan began to make public appearances, carefully orchestrated events that were as much about asserting his control as they were about taunting those who would try to stop him. He appeared on television, his face blurred and his voice distorted, speaking in riddles that unnerved all who listened. Law enforcement officials scrambled to make sense of it all, their attempts to capture him growing increasingly desperate. Ethan, though they couldn't identify him and didn't know his name, was the primary suspect in a rash of brutal murders, and the public outcry, including demands to capture and try him, grew daily. But Ethan was always one step ahead, his powers allowing him to slip through their fingers time and time again. Worse yet, Ethan wasn't alone. By his side, like twisted shadows of his former self, stood his demonic henchmen, the reincarnated souls of those he had previously harvested. They were bound to him now, their once human forms twisted into grotesque caricatures of what they had once been. Their eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and they moved with a terrifying grace, their loyalty to Ethan absolute. These disciples became Ethan's enforcers, carrying out his will with a brutality that shocked even him. They were extensions of his corrupted personality, and through them, Ethan's influence spread like a cancer, tainting everything it touched. To the public, the city was his playground. He was impervious, and he answered to no one. The world watched in horror as Ethan's reign of terror grew. Governments around the globe began to take an interest, their leaders issuing statements condemning his actions, though they were powerless to stop him. The media dubbed him the Antichrist, a moniker that only fueled the distress and havoc that Ethan had unleashed. His actions, unimpeded, inspired cults and spawned religions, spurring citizens to take sides in what they were certain was a looming apocalypse. But for Ethan, the title was meaningless. He didn't care about the labels, the headlines, or the fear. All that mattered to him now was the mission: to break free from the pact and destroy Dr. Hargrove. The public's perception of him was just another tool, another weapon in his arsenal. Though it didn't seem like it, what he truly wanted was to reclaim the humanity that had been stripped away from him. Despite the growing chaos, Ethan remained focused on his goal. He spent every waking moment searching for a way to sever the ties that bound him to Hargrove, delving into ancient texts and forgotten rituals, seeking any clue that might lead him to freedom. His public appearances were calculated distractions designed to keep Hargrove off his trail while he toiled in secret. But with each passing day, the weight of Ethan's actions became more suffocating. The souls he had harvested, the lives he had destroyed, they haunted him in ways that he couldn't have fathomed. Over time, in the face of his increasingly wanton depravity, the flame of resistance within him, which had once burned so brightly, began to flicker. He was running out of time. And then there was Emily. Every now and then his thoughts drifted to his fiancée, to the life he had left behind. The memory of her kept Ethan grounded, even as his powers threatened to overwhelm him. He had kept her at a distance, trying to protect her from the fallout of his decisions, but deep down, he knew that she was in more danger now than ever before. Hargrove's threats loomed large in his mind, and Ethan suspected the doctor was simply waiting for the right moment to strike. Ethan's lackeys, though loyal, offered little reassurance. Rather, their presence was a constant reminder of the mistakes he had made and of the suffering he had caused. Ethan knew that he was losing himself yet again, and this time to an even greater degree. The line between who he was and what he had become was growing thinner by the day, and Ethan didn't know how much longer he could hold on. The turning point came during one of his public appearances. Ethan had chosen a large, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city as the setting for his latest demonstration. The media had been tipped off, and the place was swarming with reporters, their cameras trained on the figure who had become the very mouthpiece of hell. Ethan stood on a makeshift stage, his henchmen flanking him, their eyes glowing with the same supernatural energy that coursed through him. He could feel the eyes of the world on him, their collective fear feeding the power within him. He raised his hands, signaling for silence, and the crowd fell quiet, waiting for him to speak. But before Ethan could utter a word, a sudden, searing pain shot through his chest. He gasped, doubling over, his vision blurring. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Ethan collapsed to his knees, the twisted forms of his disciples moving to support him. For a moment, Ethan was lost in torment, his mind a whirlwind of agony and confusion. But then, as suddenly as it had started, the sting subsided, leaving Ethan gasping for breath. He knew what had happened. Hargrove was watching. The plague doctor had sensed Ethan's defiance and had lashed out, punishing him for his infractions. It was a reprimand, a message that Hargrove was still in control, no matter how much power Ethan had amassed. Ethan struggled to his feet, reeling from the aftershocks, his breath ragged. The crowd was still watchful, fearful, and bewildered, but Ethan didn't care. All he could think about was Emily. Hargrove's warning had been clear. If Ethan continued on this path, the plague doctor would retaliate, and the people Ethan cared about would be the ones to suffer. And if Hargrove's attacks were enough to bring him to his knees, what with his abilities, what chance did others have? Ethan realized that he had to move quickly and find a way to end Hargrove's hold on him before it was too late. But deep down, Ethan knew there would be consequences, repercussions that nothing and no one could prepare him for. As Ethan stepped down from the stage, his followers close behind, he steeled himself. He had to keep going, had to fight back, even if it meant losing everything. He only hoped that he could handle the inevitable moment when it arrived. The crowd parted as Ethan took his leave, their fear palpable. But Ethan barely noticed. His mind was already on the next step, the next move in the game that Hargrove had forced him to play. And as the night closed in around him, Ethan breathed in deeply, savoring the last vestiges of his fleeting humanity. Whatever was going to happen next, it wasn't going to be pleasant. Hey listeners, stepping aside real quick to ask, are you listening to this on YouTube right now? If you are, it really helps us out if you would drop a like and maybe even leave a comment. Thank you for helping us feed the machine. Now, back to the story. Chapter 11. Ethan's pulse quickened as he moved through the darkened streets of Minneapolis, his thoughts plagued by the warning he had received. Hargrove's retaliatory strike had been a painful reminder of the doctor's power and the threat he posed to those Ethan loved. The meaning had been clear. Do as he was told, or the outcome would be dire. But Ethan had come too far to turn back now. He had tasted the power of salvation, however briefly it had lasted. The stakes were too high. The city around him was a blur as Ethan made his way back to his old apartment. He ruminated on his plans, each more desperate than the last. He knew that time was short, that Dr. Hargrove would not tolerate his insubordination much longer, and he worried for Emily and Sherman. The thought of Hargrove targeting them to punish him was intolerable, and he had to know whether they were safe or not. When Ethan finally reached Emily's apartment, he found himself hesitating at the threshold. Was he truly prepared for what he might find on the other side of the door? For a moment, he considered turning back and walking away from it all. At least Emily would be safe then. Or would she? If Hargrove's plan succeeded, he could spare Emily for the time being, only to condemn her and everyone else to a dystopian nightmare. And what then? No, Ethan thought. He couldn't abandon Emily to such a fate. And yet, it felt like no matter what he did, no one was escaping unscathed. With a deep breath, Ethan opened the door and left it ajar behind him. The apartment was unnaturally still, too quiet, and he felt a chill run down his spine. Something was wrong. "Emily?" Ethan called out, his voice echoing in the sparsely furnished space. There was no response. Just then, the soft padding of paws on the floor caught Ethan's attention. Sherman appeared from the hallway, his golden fur tousled and his eyes wide with anxiety. Ethan knelt down as the dog rushed to him, whining and circling him anxiously. "Hey boy, what's wrong?" Ethan asked, ruffling the fur behind Sherman's ears. The dog nudged his leg insistently, his tail low, ears pinned back. Ethan's stomach churned. Sherman was never this skittish. "Where's Emily?" Ethan whispered, though part of him already knew the answer. Sherman whined again, and Ethan rose to his feet, tension tightening in his chest. He moved through the apartment with Sherman trailing close behind, the dog's soft whimpers adding to the eerie silence. When Ethan reached the bedroom, he froze. Emily was lying on the bed, her face pale, her eyes closed. For a brief, terrifying moment, Ethan imagined she was dead. He rushed over to her side, his hands trembling as he checked for a pulse. Relief washed over him when he felt the faint thrum beneath his fingertips. But something wasn't right. Emily's breathing was shallow, her body limp, as if she were in a deep sleep. Alarmed, Ethan tried to make sense of what he was seeing. And then, the realization hit him. Hargrove. Sherman whimpered, pressing close to Ethan's leg as if sensing the danger. Ethan stood up, furious, his fists clenched. The plague doctor had struck, just as he had feared. Torturing Ethan wasn't enough to dissuade him, so Hargrove had upped the ante. The thought filled him with a rage unlike anything he had ever felt before. But even as the anger threatened to override his logic, Ethan knew he had to remain calm. He couldn't afford to lose control, not when Emily's life hung in the balance. Ethan moved to the window and paced. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. Hargrove was watching, waiting for him to make a move, and Ethan knew that the next step would be crucial. Above all else, he had to find a way to protect Emily. But before Ethan could take another step, the temperature in the room plunged. Ethan turned and saw Dr. Hargrove standing in the doorway, his form as dark and imposing as ever. His heart sank. "Mr. Hull," Hargrove said, "I warned you of the consequences of Enough! Ethan spat, cutting him off. He had heard enough. "You leave her out of this, Hargrove! This is between you and me!" Sherman growled low in his throat, standing between Ethan and Hargrove, his teeth bared in an aggressive snarl. "Sherman, no!" Ethan shouted, reaching for the dog, but Sherman stood his ground, growling louder. Hargrove tilted his head slightly. "Loyal to the end, isn't he?" The plague doctor's voice dripped with mockery. "But your pet has no place in this." With a flick of his wrist, Hargrove sent a pulse of dark energy toward Sherman. It struck the dog like a wave, lifting him off his feet and flinging him through the open doorway. Sherman let out a pained yelp as his body hit the hallway floor, skidding across the tiles. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. "No!" Ethan shouted, rushing to the door and pounding on it, but the latch wouldn't budge. He threw his weight against it, but it was sealed tight. From behind him, Hargrove's voice oozed with satisfaction. "Now, where were we?" Ethan's heart raced, grief and rage colliding inside him. He slammed his fists against the door one last time, but it remained stubbornly shut. Sherman's whines faded as the dog scrambled to his feet outside the apartment. Then, silence. The retriever was gone. Breathing heavily, Ethan turned to face Hargrove. "What have you done?" Hargrove's dark eyes gleamed beneath his mask. "Consider it a lesson, a warning of what happens when you refuse to play your part," the doctor said. "This is about more than just you. You have chosen to defy me repeatedly and have repaid my mercy with recalcitrance. I dare say my patience is worn thin, and I'm afraid that as a result, Mr. Hull, those you care about must now bear the cost." Hargrove turned his attention to Emily. "Considering the severity of your rebellion, and in order to ensure this doesn't happen again, I do believe some additional discipline is necessary." "Please," Ethan pleaded, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Don't hurt her. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't hurt her." Hargrove took a step closer. "It's too late for that, Mr. Hall. Your bed, as your kind sometimes puts it, has already been made." Before Ethan could react, Hargrove raised his hand, and another wave of energy coursed through the room, slamming into Ethan with the force of a freight train. Ethan was thrust against the far wall, the air driven from his lungs. He struggled to get to his feet, pain radiating through his body. His vision swam as he attempted to focus. But even as he fought to stand, he could feel the weight of Hargrove's authority crushing him, indomitable. "Emily!" Ethan shouted, his voice hoarse, but she didn't stir. Hargrove moved toward her, his palm outstretched, and Ethan's heart seized with anxiety. "No!" Ethan cried out, pushing himself to his feet. But it was too late. Hargrove's hand hovered over Emily, and with a simple gesture, he took his revenge. Emily's body convulsed, her eyes snapping open as she gasped for air. Ethan rushed to her side, his hands trembling as he reached for her, but before he could touch her, she collapsed back onto the bed, her body limp and lifeless. "No, no," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking as he fell to his knees beside the bed. He clutched her hand and discovered her skin had already grown cold. He tried to meet her gaze, only to find her eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. Ethan's lips quivered. It had all happened so quickly, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Emily was gone. A strangled cry tore from Ethan's throat as the reality of it all hit him. He had failed. He had defied Hargrove, and Emily had paid the ultimate price. But even as the grief threatened to devour him, rage rose to the forefront of his mind. An all-consuming, unrepentant fury, the likes of which the plague doctor hadn't seen in ages. Ethan shuddered. Hargrove had stripped him of everything that had value. His life, his dignity, and now the only person who had ever truly mattered. And for what? To prove a point? Beneath all of Ethan's outward emotions, a single thought directed toward his antagonist burned in his mind. "You will pay for this." Ethan turned to face Hargrove, his eyes blazing with unbridled ferocity. "You've taken everything from me," he said, seething. "And before this is over, I'll take everything from you, too." Hargrove remained silent, his mask hiding any hint of emotion. "This isn't over!" Ethan spat, his words brimming with venom. "You'll regret this! You'll see!" With that, Ethan stormed out of the apartment, leaving behind the body of the woman he loved, and disappeared into the night. Chapter 12. Ethan approached the old cathedral, its stone facade looming like a sentinel guarding the gates of hell. The building had been abandoned for decades, its presence more a curiosity than a landmark. But tonight, it was the epicenter of something far more sinister. It was Dr. Hargrove's location of choice for a ritual intended to conjure a portal and pull back the veil in order to unleash hell on Earth, literally. Ethan knew the plan had to be foiled, but what haunted him, more than the thought of what might happen if he failed, was the knowledge that Hargrove had also chosen him specifically to bring his infernal scheme to fruition. And, more disturbingly, that all of it seemed dependent on him. From what he could tell, Hargrove had no backup plan should anything go awry. He had been preparing Ethan for his role in the ritual for weeks and, in his arrogance, imagined no understudy was required. Ethan, for his part, planned to take advantage of the doctor's shortcomings for whatever they were worth. Unbeknownst to Hargrove, or at least Hargrove gave no indication he was aware, Ethan had been planning a ritual of his own intended to counter the doctor's. He didn't know for certain if he had the strength to see things through or if his efforts would be effective, but he owed it to everyone he cared about to try. Before heading to the church, Ethan had patrolled the nearby streets, calling out for Sherman until his throat was raw. But there had been no sign of his canine companion, and though he wished for the best, he imagined the worst. He hoped Sherman found someplace dry and safe, away from all the madness unfolding. With a sinking heart, he begrudgingly gave up the search for his dog and made his way to the cathedral. As Ethan arrived at the threshold of the sanctuary, he found his mind replaying the fateful moment when Hargrove had first unveiled his nefarious intentions. Ethan had been pacing the hallway of his apartment when Dr. Hargrove had appeared yet again. The demon's beak-like nose reminded him of a vulture inspecting its prey. Ethan had frozen mid-step, his breath catching in his throat at the sight of the doctor. "Hello, Mr. Hall," Hargrove had said. "I've been meaning to discuss our plans. Your part in them, to be exact." "Plans?" Ethan scoffed. "You mean how I'm just a pawn in your scheme?" The corners of Hargrove's mask seemed to tilt as if he were intrigued. You still underestimate your significance. A pity." "No, Ethan. You're not just some expendable piece on a chessboard. You are the centerpiece." Ethan's stomach churned, but he kept his expression blank. "I have no idea what you're talking about. And why me? What have I done to deserve this?" "Mr. Hall, whether you realize it or not, you're special." Hargrove began pacing. "Every step you've taken, every life you've harvested, was meticulously designed to prepare your body and spirit for what lies ahead. You've collected enough sin, so to speak, to open the portal yourself." Ethan furrowed his brow. "The portal?" "Yes," Hargrove confirmed. "Think of it as a door, and that door will be the gateway through which we introduce this world to its fated demise." He gestured to Ethan. "You are the ideal vessel. At the appropriate moment, you will stand at the threshold between life and oblivion as the one capable of releasing that power. Or, should you choose foolishly, sealing off the portal forever." Ethan's interest was piqued. "So you're saying I could stop it? What if I decide I want nothing to do with this anymore and don't participate?" Hargrove froze and turned to face Ethan fully. "In theory, you could act as a saboteur," Hargrove replied. "But non-participation isn't an option, my boy. The alignment occurs just once. Either you open the portal, or you ensure it stays closed forever. Ultimately, there's nothing you can do that will not in some way further my agenda. No matter what, you will play your role." "The hell I will!" Ethan shouted. "I refuse. I won't be a party to this game of yours anymore. I will not be responsible for whatever it is you have planned." Hargrove's reply was grim. "There is no refusal, Mr. Hall. If you don't show up, the ceremony will fail. But you..." Hargrove leaned in, whispering, "You'll still die. Alone, in agony, knowing you had forfeit the only opportunity you had to put an end to your servitude. And no matter what you do, it won't bring your precious Emily back, nor will it stop me from achieving my goals." With that, Hargrove disappeared, leaving Ethan with far more questions than answers. At the church, Ethan did his best to shake off the memory of Hargrove's cryptic parting words and turned his attention back to the matter at hand. The cathedral's heavy wooden doors creaked as Ethan pushed them open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the stained glass windows cast faint, distorted patterns on the stone floor. Ethan moved to the center of the structure, passing row after row of long abandoned pews. He did his best to stay calm, though every instinct he had told him to run. The ritual he had prepared outside of Hargrove's purview was his only hope, a final attempt to sever the ties that bound him to Hargrove and close the portal before it could fully open. He had no idea what would happen if it stayed closed, but of the options he had, preventing an immediate apocalypse seemed the lesser of two evils. Ethan stood alone near the altar and took a deep breath as he prepared to begin his own ritual. He had arrived before Hargrove, though he was certain his activities would garner the doctor's attention if they hadn't already. He had to move quickly. Just as Ethan opened his mouth to utter the first of several incantations, he heard the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the cathedral. No, Ethan thought, not yet. His body tensed, his mind racing as fear gripped him, anticipating Hargrove's arrival. But as the footsteps drew closer, that fear gave way to a flicker of hope. It wasn't the sound of human or demonic footsteps he heard, but the all-too-familiar patter of paws. Ethan gasped in relief and smiled, despite the situation, as Sherman emerged from the shadows, his golden fur a welcome sight under the circumstances. "Sherman!" Ethan cried, his voice breaking with emotion. "Is that really you? How did you find me?" The dog approached, his tail wagging, but there was a tension in his movements, a wariness in his eyes. Sherman nuzzled Ethan's hand, whimpered softly, and gave his master a knowing look. "I know, boy, I know," Ethan said, mustering a half-hearted smile. "This is so much worse than the vet." Ethan wanted to hold Sherman close to protect him, but he knew that Sherman had followed him here out of loyalty, and that allegiance now put them both in grave danger and had cost him valuable time. He needed to resume the incantations, and soon. But before Ethan could act, the temperature in the cathedral dropped sharply, the air rippling with unseen energy. Ethan's heart sank as he realized that Sherman's arrival had not only delayed his counter-ritual, but had also drawn Hargrove's attention. He was out of time. A mocking, disembodied laugh echoed through the cathedral, sending shivers down Ethan's spine. "So, you brought your dog to witness your failure, Mr. Hall? How quaint." Ethan turned, and there, emerging from the shadows, was Dr. Hargrove, his tall, imposing figure more menacing than ever. Ethan's fear for Sherman surged, but he forced himself to stay focused. He had come too far to let Hargrove win. "This ends tonight!" Ethan shouted. Hargrove chuckled, his usually emotionless voice now uncharacteristically filled with cruel amusement. "Oh, Mr. Hall, you are far too late to try and stop me now. The door is already opening. Your fate, and the fate of this world, was sealed the moment you made the pact." With a sweeping gesture, Hargrove raised his hands, and the air around them crackled. The very fabric of reality seemed to twist and warp as the portal began to take shape, a powerful, swirling vortex of darkness at the heart of the church. Without Hargrove having uttered so much as a word, the gateway tugged at Ethan, threatening to tear him apart. Instinctively, Sherman let out a low, menacing growl, positioning himself between Ethan and Hargrove. The normally docile retriever bared his teeth in a display of ferocity that took even Ethan by surprise. "Sherman, no!" Ethan rasped, torn between admiration and fear. His protective instincts demanded he pull his companion back, but he knew that Sherman wouldn't back down. Not now, not anymore. The dog was determined to protect his master, no matter the cost. Hargrove sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think your dog can save you, Mr. Hall? How pathetic." Ethan, rather than back down, took Hargrove's insult as a challenge and began reciting his incantations anew. "Ah, aren't we full of tricks today, Mr. Hull?" Hargrove chided. "I see you fancy yourself a magician of sorts. But no matter. Your attempts to prevent the inevitable are doomed to fail, Mr. Hull. I have taught you well, but not that well." Ethan remained steadfast and focused, ignoring Hargrove's taunts. He recited line after practiced line in spite of his doubts and inexperience, such that even as the words left Hargrove's mouth, the cathedral itself began to tremble. The clash between the light and darkness of Ethan and Hargrove's respective rituals was too much for the old structure to bear. The stone floor beneath them began to crack and crumble, the walls groaning as the building started to shift. Wide fissures opened in the floor, the century-old stone warping and splitting as the two forces battled for dominance. Ethan knew he had to act fast. Trembling, he continued, his voice steady despite the chaos around him, despite his body's threats to betray him. The air hummed with energy as the light of the ritual grew, pushing back against the plague doctor's dark magic. But Hargrove wasn't about to let Ethan succeed without a fight. The demon raised both his hands once more, and, as if on cue, the portal began to grow, its edges crackling violently. Sherman barked furiously, his body shaking with the effort, his eyes locked onto Hargrove with a vicious determination. Unbeknownst to Ethan, Hargrove made eye contact with Sherman, and for a moment, a seemingly insignificant moment, the doctor's own resolve flickered, the first inward signs of doubt. Unaware, Ethan pressed on. As the battle between the rituals intensified, the sanctuary shook violently, the floor beneath them shifting and breaking apart. Meanwhile, the portal was expanding, threatening to engulf everything in its path. Ethan's knees buckled as he felt the strain of his efforts to keep the gateway from opening further, but he rose again, refusing to stay down. He was pouring everything he had into the ritual, but Hargrove's power was immense, and time was running out. Then, in an act of unexpected desperation, Hargrove lashed out, not at Ethan, but at Sherman. The plague doctor's hand shot forward, and a bolt of dark energy struck the retriever, sending him crashing against the stone floor. Sherman yelped in pain, his body convulsing as the current coursed through him, tearing his flesh. "No!" Ethan screamed, his heart shattering as he watched his loyal companion fall. For an instant, Ethan hesitated. But Sherman wasn't done yet. Despite the pain, despite the injuries that should have incapacitated him, he struggled to his feet, his legs trembling, blood dripping from his fur. The dog limped back toward Ethan, his eyes never leaving his master's, his determination unwavering. Hargrove smirked, his voice filled with cruel satisfaction. "You would sacrifice your pet for this? I believe I've underestimated how selfish and cruel you could truly be, Mr. Hull. I dare say I'm impressed." Ethan's grief and anger collided in a moment of passion Hargrove should have expected, but didn't. "He's not just a pet!" Ethan screamed, his voice filled with a strength that surprised even him. "He's family, and if you touch him again, I won't just stop you, I'll kill you." With a roar of defiance, Ethan refocused and completed his counter-ritual, the final words tearing through the darkness like scissors through silk. A new power surged within him in that moment, unlike that which the doctor had bestowed upon him. No, this was something different. Some way, somehow, Ethan was serving a new master. Ethan felt the ties that bound him to Hargrove snapping, one by one, as the effects of his incantations took hold. Hargrove recoiled, his form flickering as the light of the ritual enveloped him. If Ethan could have seen Hargrove's reaction, hidden behind the pointed beak of his mask, he would have seen something novel etched upon the doctor's face. terror. "No!" Hargrove cried. "This isn't possible!" But Ethan didn't stop. He pushed forward, repeating the incantations again for good measure, his voice rising above the din as the ritual again reached its peak. Hargrove, for his part, now seemed powerless to stop him. The light grew brighter, more intense, until, at last, it was blinding, filling the entire church with a radiance that defied explanation. The cathedral seemed to quake, the stone floor beneath them buckling and cracking even more violently. And then, with a conclusive, ear-splitting shriek, Hargrove himself was consumed by the light, his very form disintegrating, leaving behind only a faint echo of his voice, filled with disbelief and rage. The portal, weakened considerably, collapsed in on itself, dissipating as the last traces of Hargrove's influence waned. The cathedral fell silent, the only sound the faint echo of the wind as it blew through the broken windows. But the victory was bittersweet. Ethan turned to Sherman and found his beloved companion lying still and breathing shallow. The dog's eyes met Ethan's, and in them, Ethan saw the same loyalty and love that had always been there. But beneath it, there was something else. Indescribable pain. Ethan's heart crumbled. "Sherman," Ethan whispered, crawling over to his friend. But as he reached out to touch him, the building shook once more, the floor beneath Sherman giving way. The fissures that had opened during the battle widened, forming chasms. Sherman let out a soft whimper as he struggled to stand, aware of the danger he was in, but his injuries were too severe. Hargrove's attack had done its damage, and now the rapidly collapsing church was finishing what he had started. "No, no, no, no!" Ethan's voice broke as he cradled Sherman's head in his hands, his tears falling onto the dog's golden fur. Sherman looked up at Ethan, his eyes filled with agony, but also with a quiet acceptance. Ethan's heart ached as he whispered, "I'm so sorry." Chapter 13. Sherman's eyes met Ethan's one last time, filled with that same unwavering loyalty, and then, with a final pained whimper, his body went limp. A moment later, the ground beneath them trembled violently, and before Ethan could react, the floor split open further, and Sherman's lifeless form slipped into the widening crevice. "No!" Ethan screamed, his voice echoing through the crumbling cathedral as he reached out in vain. It was too late. The grief that Ethan had tried so hard to hold back throughout the battle finally overwhelmed him, and he collapsed beside the gaping fissure, his body racked with sobs. Part of him wished it had taken him too, if only to spare him any further grief. The weight of everything he had lost, Emily, his own humanity, and now Sherman, could no longer be ignored. But even in the depths of his despair, Ethan knew that he had one last task to complete. The portal had been closed, and Hargrove had been destroyed, as he had promised, but the forces that had been unleashed had left the structure on the brink of collapse. Ethan could feel the entire building groaning under the strain, the roof threatening to cave in at any moment. He had to seal the remnants of the portal and prevent any chance of it reopening. He knew that doing so would require what little strength he had left, but Ethan didn't care. He had nothing left to live for, except to ensure that no one else would suffer the way he had. With every ounce of energy left in his battered body, Ethan focused on the remainder of his counter-ritual, completing the final incantation for a second time, forcefully drawing out every syllable. The ground beneath him shuddered as the ripple in space-time that had first birthed the portal began to waver, and with a resounding burst, the last vestiges of Hargrove's dark arts pulsed once more, and then vanished. The walls of the cathedral, finally succumbing to the damage inflicted upon them, began to collapse inward, large chunks of stone falling from the ceiling. Below Ethan's feet, the floor buckled and cracked. The entire building was coming down around him. As the ceiling began to cave in, Ethan closed his eyes. He had done what he set out to do. He had stopped Hargrove, closed the portal, and prevented the apocalypse. And now, he hoped, he would find peace. The last thing Ethan felt was the crushing weight of the debris as it struck him, burying him beneath the rubble of the cathedral. The world was quiet and still, the aftermath of the battle leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The stones that had stood for decades lay scattered and broken, and beneath them all, an unlikely hero refusing to die took a labored breath and thought of Emily. Amidst the ruins, a team of firefighters and rescue workers worked frantically, digging through the debris in a desperate attempt to find survivors. The scene was chaotic, with the sound of heavy machinery and shouted orders filling the air as the rescuers raced against time. "Over here!" one of the firefighters shouted, his voice filled with urgency. "I think I found someone!" The others rushed to his side, their hands digging through the rubble with renewed determination. And then, finally, they uncovered him. Ethan, his body broken and battered, but somehow still alive. "Stay with us, buddy," one of the rescue workers said, his voice shaking as he knelt beside Ethan. "We're gonna get you out of here." Ethan's eyes fluttered open momentarily, his vision blurred, his mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. The pain was overwhelming, but through the haze, he could feel the hands of the rescue workers lifting him, pulling him from the building's remains. "We've got a live one!" another firefighter shouted as they carefully transferred Ethan onto a stretcher. "Let's get him to the hospital, now!" The ambulance raced through the city streets, sirens blaring, as Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness. He could feel the life slipping away from him, the strength that had sustained him through the battle now nearly depleted. But there remained a sense of relief in knowing that he had done what he needed to do. In spite of the pain, his eyes softened and he mustered a smile. "Hey, buddy," one of the first responders said, taking notice and giving Ethan a playful pat on the shoulder. "That's what we like to see. You're gonna be all right. Hang in there." When they arrived at the hospital, Ethan was rushed into the emergency room where his former colleagues sprang into action. The doctors and nurses who had worked alongside him for years now did everything in their power to save him, their faces grim with determination. "Come on, Ethan," one of the doctors muttered under his breath as he worked frantically to stabilize him. "You're not going out like this." But even as they fought to keep him alive, Ethan knew that it was too late. His injuries were too severe. He closed his eyes, his mind drifting as the pain began to fade, replaced by a gentle numbness. As the world around him faded away, Ethan saw something unexpected. A verdant pasture stretching out before him, bathed in the warm, golden light of a setting sun. The air was fresh and sweet, filled with the scent of wildflowers, and in the distance he could hear the gentle sound of a stream flowing over smooth stones. It wasn't at all what he had expected. He expected nothing, if he was being honest, or perhaps an inky void. In the worst-case scenario, he expected suffering and hellfire, further punishment for his sins. He had never believed in God or in heaven. He had chosen to put his faith in science and tangible things. And yet, here he was, in a place of peace and rest, a place he could only describe as heavenly. And standing there, waiting for him, were Emily and Sherman. Ethan couldn't believe what he was seeing. He rubbed his eyes as if expecting to wake from a dream and find himself still trapped in his dismal apartment, awaiting orders from a demon in a mask. But when he removed his fingers, they were still there, as real as the warmth of the sun shining down on his unblemished face. Emily's eyes were clear and bright, free from the shadows of her addiction. There, beside her, Sherman stood tall, his tail wagging, his fur gleaming in the beautiful sunlight. there was nary a sign of their prior injuries or illnesses. It was then that Ethan noticed he too was free of pain and of breaks and bruises. Even his depression and anxiety, once a staple of his daily life, were afterthoughts. An energy coursed through him here too, like before, but it was cleaner, fresher. Ethan took a deep breath, savoring the sweetness of the air, and ran toward his loved ones, his heart swelling with joy. Emily smiled, her arms open wide, and Sherman barked happily, running to greet him. "You did it, Ethan," Emily whispered as she embraced him, her voice filled with love and pride. "You did it." Ethan wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as tears of relief and happiness filled his eyes. "I'm so sorry, Emily," he whispered. "I'm sorry for everything." Emily shook her head and smiled gently. "There's nothing to be sorry for. You're home now. We're together again." Sherman pressed against Ethan's leg, his warm, familiar presence a comfort to his weary soul. Ethan knelt down, running his hand through the dog's soft fur, and Sherman licked his face, his eyes beaming with a love and loyalty that knew no limits. Ethan peered at Emily and then at the beautiful, pristine landscape that surrounded them. The world he had left behind was healing, coming together in the face of nearly certain doom, and Ethan had landed in a paradise he never thought he deserved, even at his best. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan took Emily's hand, and together, with Sherman by their side, they walked into the light, leaving the pain and darkness of the past behind. Ethan Hull, for once, had finally found peace. Chapter 14. The world moved on, as it always does, in the wake of Ethan's sacrifice. The collapse of the cathedral and the strange supernatural events surrounding it became the stuff of local legend, whispered about in hushed tones among the residents of Minneapolis and across the world. Official reports attributed the disaster to structural failure, a plausible explanation for the public, but those who had been nearby at the time, those who had seen the impossible, knew that something far removed from the official explanation had taken place. Globally, the mysterious figure, dubbed by some as the Antichrist, had been a source of widespread panic. Reports of his terrifying appearances, the unexplainable murders, and the shadowy forces he commanded had struck fear into the hearts of millions. But just as suddenly as the sightings began, they ended, coinciding with the collapse of the cathedral. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief, unaware that the man behind the blurred face was Ethan Hull, whose sacrifice, ironically, had brought an end to the terror. That Ethan and the Antichrist figure were one and the same remained unsuspected, the blurring of his features protecting his identity even in death. Despite the official explanation of the cathedral's destruction, in circles of critical thinkers and conspiracy theorists, it was long suspected that the collapse, the demonic appearances, and the murders were all connected. Over time, the tale grew muddied, the exact details lost to history. The truth of what truly happened in Minneapolis became just another legend, debated but never fully understood. For those who knew Ethan, the loss was deeply personal. His former colleagues at the hospital, who had fought valiantly to save him on the night of his death, carried the weight of his passing with them. They spoke of him with a mixture of sorrow and respect, remembering the man who had been both a dedicated nurse and a friend, but who had also been plagued by personal demons throughout his life. How personal and real the demons had been, they would never know. Amidst the ruins of the cathedral, the rescue workers had recovered not only Ethan's body, but also Sherman's. The sight of the golden retriever lying near his master, even in death, touched the hearts of those who found them. The two were buried together, side by side, in a quiet cemetery just outside the city. A memorial service was held for Ethan and Sherman, a quiet, somber affair attended by those who had known them best. The hospital where Ethan had worked set up a small memorial in their honor, a simple plaque engraved with both their names, placed in the garden where Ethan used to take his breaks. The inscription read, "In memory of Ethan Hull and his beloved dog Sherman, faithful companions in life and beyond." Emily's family, having been informed of her fate, mourned her loss privately. They knew nothing of the supernatural events that had led to her death, only that she had been found lifeless in her apartment. Her death was ruled to have been the result of natural causes, blamed on a previously undetected heart condition. They remembered her as she had been before the addiction took hold, a bright, vibrant woman who had loved deeply and been loved in return. The cathedral, now a ruin, was eventually cleared away, the rubble removed, and the site left as an empty lot. The land was considered cursed by some, haunted by others, and no one dared to build there again. Life for everyone else, as it always does, went on. The world outside of Minneapolis never knew the truth of what had happened in that old cathedral. Not really. To them, Ethan Hull was just another casualty of a tragic accident, his story lost in the fog of history. And if you had asked Ethan what he thought of that, he would have told you that was just fine. Somewhere, in a place far beyond the reach of the living, Ethan walked hand in hand with Emily, Sherman bounding joyfully at their side. And for Ethan Hull, that's all that mattered. You've been listening to Ethan Hell Part 2 by Craig Groshek. Craig Groshek is the creator and operator of the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights YouTube channel, which has grown to nearly 500,000 subscribers, over 3,000 uploads, and more than 69 million video views in its 12 years of operation. He also oversees production of 4 weekly audio horror fiction podcasts, faithfully adapting and featuring the work of thousands of indie horror authors. A published author himself, dozens of his short stories have been adapted for this channel and other platforms. He holds a bachelor's degree in communication from the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point. In his free time, Groshek enjoys a wide range of outdoor activities, traveling, and spending time with 3 horror-loving children and his friends. And with that, dear listeners, we conclude Ethan's tale. It's nice to see something end on a high note for a change, even though that high note includes the death of our protagonist. Then again, every other happily ever after eventually ends up the same way, I suppose. In any event, thank you for joining me on this most hallowed of eves. Whether your evening involves tricks and treats, or horror movies with friends, or cranking up some misfits and knocking back a few cold ones, I wish you a happy Halloween from myself and the entire Chilling Tales team. Even though we now have a whole year to wait for this holiday to roll back around, we still have plenty of scary stories to fill the next 11 months of banal drudgery. I hope to see you back next week, and until then, stay spooky. You've been listening to the Horror Hill Podcast, a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. Tonight's episode was hosted and narrated by yours truly, Erik Peabody. Original music provided by Erik Peabody and Nikki McSorley. Finalization by Erik Peabody and Craig Groshek. Got a terrifying tale of your own that you'd like performed? Email it to us at natalie@chillingtalesfordarknights.com to have your work considered for future production. Seeing as how we're all living in a technological nightmare of our own devising, I'll ask you to follow Chilling Tales for Dark Nights on social media and upvote, subscribe, and hit the bell notification icon if you're listening to this on YouTube. Not only will you have appeased the dark gods of cyberspace, but you'll be kept in the loop as we prepare more terrifying content. If you'd like access to uninterrupted horror, free of ads and these annoying bookend segments, might I recommend becoming a patron? You'll get access to hundreds of episodes of this show, as well as everything from the other programs in the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights cabal. That means all of Otis Gyri's Scary Stories Told in the Dark, Drew Blood's Dark Tales, Paul J. McSorley's Fear from the Heartland, and more. It's a veritable smorgasbord of horrific delights. As for me personally, I'm on most social media as Viking Guitar or Viking Guitar Productions. I'm always on the lookout for new stories to narrate and new music projects to mix or master. If that's of interest to you, feel free to reach out and we can talk turkey. Also, I will be back next week with more terrifying tales to keep you up all night. If darkness is what you're after, listener, your search is over. Yet, let it be known, you haven't found the darkness. The darkness has found you.
Chilling Tales for Dark Nights.